Hi, I am Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and it is my privilege today to host a webinar on the conflict over Hong Kong, implications of Beijing's new national security law. We have a distinguished group of panelists today. Ambassador Kurt Tong, who served as United States Consul General and Chief of Mission in Hong Kong from 2016 to 2019, and is now a partner at the Asia Group in Washington, D.C. We are also joined by Professor James Feineman, the James M. Morita Professor of Asian Legal Studies and co-director of the Georgetown Law Asia Program at Georgetown University. We also have Professor Stephen Tsang, the director of the SOAS Chinese Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. And last but not least is our own Paul Hare, a distinguished fellow at the Center for the National Interest and a former national intelligence officer for East Asia. Our discussion today will be comprised, I suspect, of two parts. The first part is the direct implications of Beijing's new national security law, which went into effect on June 30th. What are its implications for Hong Kong? Will we see Britain and the United States have now suspended extradition treaties with Hong Kong? We want to discuss as well the implications for Hong Kong's judiciary, for its legal system, and for its economic future. The other aspect of Hong Kong, which I don't think that many people anticipated, was that in a sense, it's becoming what we always thought Taiwan would be, which is a flashpoint in the relations between China and the United States. Yesterday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was in London and met with the activist Nathan Lee, and he also met with the former Governor General of Hong Kong, Chris Patten. Pompeo referred directly to Hong Kong and called for a new global coalition to oppose the CCP and to show to the Chinese that they cannot, quote, engage in this kind of behavior, unquote. It is also the case that in the past day, the Trump administration has given the Chinese consulate in Houston 72 hours to disband and withdraw its officials. Senator Marco Rubio was on Twitter today and accused the consulate in Houston of being, quote, a central node in a vast Chinese spy network. Relations between the United States and China appear to be spiraling out of control. The Chinese are threatening retaliation. Hong Kong obviously plays a central role in all of this. With that, I would like to go first to Ambassador Kurt Tong and ask him what he thinks are the direct implications of the new national security law in Hong Kong.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for including me in this event. I was just looking at the list of attendees, and it's quite a great group. And so I'll try and meet the standards of this gathering. The national security law, I believe, is really the single most significant action that the PRC has taken thus far in the 23-year history of Hong Kong to undermine and limit the high degree of autonomy which it promised Hong Kong in the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 and the Basic Law of 1990. The law will have, I believe, rather far-reaching repercussions, particularly in the political space and in media, and as it impacts freedom of expression and fosters an atmosphere of self-censorship in Hong Kong. The intent of Beijing with the implementation of this law, as I understand it, is twofold. One is to shock the Hong Kong system by implementing it over the heads of the city, not going through the Legislative Council, not following the procedures which had been expected of give and take, pushback, debate regarding a national security law, which had actually been taking place for 20 years. And the other is to fundamentally change the legal environment regarding political activity and particularly political dissent. So the goal is to essentially take away elements of political autonomy in Hong Kong to the degree that that's been expressed over the last 2 decades. The concern, I think, of many people is that it will have an impact, a broader impact, even beyond that negative impact. You know, from an American perspective or a Western perspective, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of political activity, and point of view are things which should not be abridged. But the law, even as it intends to go after those freedoms, it could have a broader impact. And that would happen, I think, through a number of channels, one of which is, as I mentioned, self-censorship and a chilling of the atmosphere around expression of views through the media, which could impact an entire sector of how Hong Kong operates. Hong Kong has a very vibrant civil society, lots and lots of NGOs who mix both political points of view and social activity, do-gooding and political activity at the same time. That could all be impacted significantly. And also the economy, either through undermining the degree of respect and confidence that people have in Hong Kong's independent judiciary, or by making people call into question the role of the Hong Kong government and whether it will be an impartial arbiter in a regulatory sense or in a legal sense in how the economy operates. And those factors have been really crucial to the economic success that Hong Kong enjoys as a high-end, service-based, financial center economy. And that, I think, is bad news. And so I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time trying to help corporations sort through the implications for their own operations and just how much of an impact this will have. Clearly, Hong Kong continues to exist. There's still 7 million people there. It's still operating. The economy is still going. But the nature of the city could change significantly under the national security law.
Professor Feinerman, I'd like to ask you to comment next, and if your view is similar, or do you have a different take?
No, I definitely agree with Ambassador Tong, and there are several aspects of the new law, not to get too deeply into the weeds, that are very concerning along the lines that he's generally described. You know, first of all, the law creates the possibility under Article 38 of the new national security law that criminalizes any activity that's deemed to be a threat to China's national security carried out by anyone of any nationality anywhere on the planet. The United States is often criticized for the extraterritorial reach of our laws, but this is really an extraordinary provision. And the PRC government has been contacted since July 1st to clarify this position, and the clarifications seem to just amplify what everyone feared about the global reach of this law. Now, obviously, someone who does this and doesn't present themselves on PRC or any national territory of China, including Hong Kong, probably is beyond the reach of Chinese officials. But as we know from the cases of various people, including the booksellers who were spirited away from Hong Kong into imprisonment in mainland China, this is a very dangerous provision of the law. It also, in some ways, seems to contradict assurances that were made in connection with the basic law. It starts out, the national security law, very anodyne and says, you know, we're just reasserting things that were present in the basic law from its inception. But then there are contradictory provisions, including the fact that some of the provisions of this law go directly against the international covenants, which China has asserted are incorporated in the basic law of Hong Kong and seem to be contradicted by these provisions. One of them, Article 42, basically contradicts the presumption of innocence, which is fundamental in common law and has been a principle in Hong Kong law since its inception. You know, the presumption of innocence that no one is guilty unless proven so, because it says that a criminal suspect or defendant cannot be granted bail unless the judge has sufficient grounds for believing that the criminal suspect or defendant will not continue to commit acts endangering national security. And this may explain why so many of the people who were involved in previous movements, the umbrella movement and the movements since 2019, have decided to exit Hong Kong's territory because they're in danger of never being able to escape with bail the imprisonment that they might experience in Hong Kong. And finally, there are a couple of bodies that the law creates that I think are very, at the least, troubling and perhaps directly contradictory to the rule of law. The law creates a committee for safeguarding national security that's headed by the chief executive, but the committee works in secret and its decisions are unreviewable by any court. Now, this is mainly top leadership of Hong Kong, various secretaries of departments and the chief executive, but it's pretty clear that they will be taking direction from the PRC, and this is amplified by Article 48, the last specific provision I'm going to mention, that provides for the establishment within the Hong Kong territory of an Office for Safeguarding National Security. And it's similar to the liaison office that was created at the outset of Hong Kong's turnover to the PRC. It's completely staffed by mainland officials appointed by mainland authorities, and it has the power to handle, without further description, national security cases. So it's pretty clear that this is, taking the power away potentially from Hong Kong courts and turning it over to this mainland body whenever the national security provisions are invoked. And this, I think, is very troubling for the continuity of the rule of law as it was previously experienced even after 1997 in Hong Kong.
Well, next I'd like to get the view from Britain. We have Professor Sang from the University of London. What is your perspective on this national security law?
I agree with both James and Kurt that it is really serious. In fact, I will go a little bit further. I see the national security law as a game changer for Hong Kong. Ever since Hong Kong was part of China in 1997, there has been steady erosion of Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. But they were erosions that people in Hong Kong and people outside of Hong Kong can pretend that they were not happening, or they're not happening enough for us to actually say that the one country, two system model is being compromised. I think the national security law is one of those occasions when this has changed. I think James in particular has highlighted some of the substance of the law, and they are serious. They really should attract our attention. But I think we also need to be paying attention not only to the contents of the law, but the process of how this was being imposed and how it was intended to basically shut all dissenting voices out in Hong Kong. Essentially, almost everything that were being done in the protest in Hong Kong of the second half of 2019 have been criminalized. The extraterritorial bits that James says means that if one of my students in one of my classes in London should ask the question, does China really have a right to govern Hong Kong? And if that is being reported back to Hong Kong or to China, that student would have committed a crime. And this is what we're dealing with. And by the Chinese government not following the basic law, Article 23, which says that Hong Kong needs to legislate a national security law, but by the National People's Congress Standing Committee legislating on behalf of Hong Kong with no consultation whatsoever with either people or the government in Hong Kong, it shows that the government really doesn't accept anybody else's interpretation of what the one country, two systems means, or what the obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration and international treaty registered at the UN over Hong Kong means. Doesn't really worry too much about what how the basic law should be interpreted by others any longer. Now, this is really making a huge change by creating the parallel jurisdictions in Hong Kong for cases that will be chosen to be tried under this new alternative judicial system. I think in a way, the Chinese government is trying to say that we're still protecting the common law legal system in Hong Kong. What they have failed to see is that for judges in the common law traditions, they may not be able to accept that as still protecting the integrity of the rule of law and the independent judiciary in Hong Kong. Will senior British, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian judges still agree to serve on Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal? We don't know yet. But that is a question that I think they will now have to ask. And if they decide that they cannot give credibility to a system that is now being discredited, then we are going to see the whole belief that the independent judiciary in Hong Kong still exists being questioned. And that is a real issue there. And that's why I say what we're looking at here is a game changer. It is a very big deal. That's why we are seeing the kind of responses that we have seen from London. I'll stop here.
Thank you. I want to turn to Paul Hare next and sharpen my question a little bit for him in listening to the three previous speakers who have eloquently described the draconian consequences for Hong Kong. But at the same time, Hong Kong was envisioned by some as a territory that would, in a sense, infect China with the democratic virus. Yet now we see that China is acting much more aggressively than many other countries, particularly in the West, anticipated. So Paul, my question to you would be, should we really be surprised that, however lamentable it may be, that China is in fact acting to protect what it sees as its national interests towards a territory that was colonized by the British? And we know that there is still a virulent resentment toward the imperial legacy in China. So are the Chinese actually simply acting on their own national interests, however brutal it may be, or are they overreaching? And anyone can jump in after Paul on this question, but I'd like Paul to tackle it first.
No, that's an excellent question. I mean, my short answer is no, we should not be surprised because the Chinese are visceral and, very hard line on any of these sovereignty issues. And when you mention it in that historical context, I mean, Hong Kong was really, the loss of Hong Kong was the beginning of the century of humiliation for the Chinese. And so I think that infects part of their approach to it even today. It's still unfinished business as long as the rest of the world is trying to interfere with the way they choose to govern Hong Kong. Now, in terms of the implications of, how that's reflected in what they've done recently, I mean, I'm a little surprised at how we came to this point, but not having reached this point of the Chinese response. I mean, I agree with what Kurt and James and Steve have all said about what Beijing is up to here. I mean, they clearly had reached the limit of their tolerance for the protest movement and have been trying and are doing this for the purpose of reining it in. They calculated, frankly, that they needed to do this because they'd lost confidence in the Hong Kong government's ability to do so, especially because the Hong Kong government had, as I think has already been mentioned, had failed to enact national security legislation, which it was obliged to do under the basic law. I mean, I think the Chinese probably believe themselves when they assert that they will only apply this law selectively to prevent violence, and that they didn't intend it to represent the abandonment of one country, two systems, or some level of autonomy for the Chinese. But for all the reasons that Kurt has mentioned, especially, the damage is already being done. And it's going to be very hard for the people of Hong Kong or anybody else, frankly, to, determine the difference between enforcement of this law and the retention of any level of autonomy for Hong Kong. Now, the one caveat I would add, though, and I'm not sure whether this is a dissenting view, is that I still think that there is that the jury is still out in some elements with some respect on the issue of one country, two systems. And I think this is partly because the national security issue is somewhat separate from the issue of democratic electoral reform, which has been percolating for the same time period. But there's been an interactive dynamic between them, between these two issues that really led to the culmination of it last year. I mean, the success of the protests going back a decade and more against national security legislation has really reinforced the resistance among the same anti-establishment, pro-democracy movement against Beijing's proposals for electoral reform. And both of these obviously reinforced, the fact that both of these things happened reinforced Beijing's lack of confidence in the Hong Kong government's ability to manage the situation. At the same time that the protesters were getting more emboldened, the fault lines, this is kind of a side issue, but it's relevant, the fault lines started to become more apparent within the protest movement and within the opposition movement, which was less unified in how it was going to deal with the situation. And I think all of this came to a head last year during the protests against the government on the extradition law. And I think this is which led to more violence than they'd seen before. And I think this was the thing that convinced the Chinese they needed to bring the hammer down. Now, I mention all this. Well, the two things I think that are reflected in terms of why Beijing needed to act this way, unfortunately for the protest movement, the anti-establishment movement, the pro-democracy movement, Beijing was always going to have the leverage as the sovereign to insist upon its own interpretation of what its obligations were going to be under the basic law on both national security legislation and electoral reform. And I think that, frankly, it's beginning to appear that the opposition movement may have underestimated or overestimated, I should say, the amount of leverage that its international supporters were going to have in imposing a more flexible interpretation upon the Chinese. I only mention this for two reasons. I think it's possible that, it didn't have to end this way. I mention this because there's some possibility that there might have been an opportunity back during the period of the umbrella movement to reach some kind of a compromise on either the national security or electoral reform issues that was lost because neither side was prepared to compromise. But I mention this especially because I think I don't think that Beijing's goal in enacting the national security law in an attempt to assert more control necessarily meant to them an abandonment of one country, two systems, or an abandonment of some level of change in the electoral reform process that would allow for whatever level of autonomy it perceived. Nor do I think, frankly, that it represented a goal by the Chinese to abandon all the benefits that have accrued to China from Hong Kong over the past several years. But obviously, Beijing's insistence on control and security trumped all of those things. And it gets back to the point you raised. I think that's because for historical and domestic stability reasons, they felt they just had to assume control to prevent things from getting worse.
I'd like to ask our other three panelists a question following on Paul's remarks. All three of you are sitting in the West Wing in a small cubicle in the National Security Council, starting with Ambassador Tong, then Professor Feinerman and Professor Sang. But first, Ambassador Tong, what would you tell President Trump to do?
First, I'd tell him to figure out where the unmute button is. And then I would suggest the following. I mean, the president has already done what Congress also asked him to do, which is change the status of Hong Kong under US law. Not entirely, but to a significant extent. And particularly the overlay of the US-Hong Kong relationship has shifted from one that recognized Hong Kong's autonomy to one that questions it. And policy then flows from that. That may have been an inevitable step given the legislative history in the US and the fact that we passed a law back in 1992 specifically to recognize and support Hong Kong's autonomy, but including in that recognition, the recognition that if things change, then the U.S. point of view should change. So that's been the main pillar of the U.S. executive branch response. But the problem with that is that it actually weakens the U.S. relationship with Hong Kong and damages U.S. national interest and Hong Kong city interest, not hugely, but to a measurable extent, and has very little, if any, impact on China. And at the same time, it plays into the narrative that Beijing actually likes of Hong Kong being a pawn between China and the West, which plays into all of that post-colonial national pride mindset, and further justifies China's actions vis-a-vis Hong Kong. The thing that's most, you asked a question about whether it was surprising that China did this at this time. It maybe not surprising, but it's certainly disappointing, because China had managed to exert self-discipline for 2 decades based upon its own perception of its own national interest and the relative balance of the benefit of having Hong Kong as part of the Chinese economy, promoting change and strength in the Chinese economy, versus what, from Beijing's perspective, has always been the downsides of a different political system within Hong Kong. So
that leads me, if I can just interject.
So get to your question.
Well, I just want to say that's a fascinating point. Do you think that that China has miscalculated the costs here?
Well, yes, my opening remarks, I think China has miscalculated the costs. So the exercise of US policy, and also that of other countries at this point, I think the main point of emphasis should be trying to not necessarily worsen the costs that China will suffer by damaging the fabric of Hong Kong, but rather seeking to constantly remind China that it has made a mistake. And that can be done through diplomacy, and it can be done through some actions, sanctions, whatever. You can sanction people, they sanction people back, great. You do some sanctions, wonderful. It doesn't actually accomplish anything or change any mindset. So I would like to see a concerted diplomatic campaign, rather than Secretary Pompeo going to London and declaring that he is opposed to the one political party in China, basically meaning that he's calling for regime change in the world's largest country. But rather, on the Hong Kong issue, getting all the countries together and saying, we will together every year figure out a way, or every month, to remind China that it's hurting itself and that it's broken its promise to itself and to the Hong Kong people and to the international community. Because that promise aspect, together with China's self-interest, those I think are the hooks here, rather than specific physical or financial or sanctions type leverage. Some of that's fine in order to make the point, but certainly no one should have an expectation that kind of activity is going to deter China in following through on its policies in its own national territory.
Professor Feinerman, I wondered if you might like to comment on that as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that I agree with everything that Ambassador Tong has said, especially about the sort of balance that we're seeing with regard to the mainland US-China relationship. But the problem that I think is still unresolved is this aspect of the removal of special treatment for Hong Kong that really does harm Hong Kong and Hong Kong people much more than it harms anyone in the PRC. And I don't see how this really endears us even to the people in Hong Kong who are most fiercely anti-Beijing, pro-independence even, because it's going to make a big difference in their daily lives. And the needle that we were able to thread for a long time, I think, began to disappear early on in the Trump administration. I mean, the overtures that he made to Taiwan and Tsai Ing-wen, even when he was just a president-elect, set us on a path which, you know, Beijing has equal or even greater responsibility for taking the bilateral relationship down. But it's just led to, you know, this sort of useless confrontation as far as the interests of the 7 million people who live in Hong Kong are actually concerned. And I think that's a very sad development here. The other thing that, and this may be going on, and I just don't understand it because I'm not, you know, privy to the what's going on in diplomacy and other realms, but it seems like there needs to be some sort of track 2 possibility for dialogue between the US and China, specifically about Hong Kong, that would make it possible to, you know, advance some sort of rapprochement. And I understand, you know, Beijing's view is that, look, we held our fire for a long time. We waited. We told you, you know, at the very beginning that this Article 23 legislation about national security had to be passed, and you wouldn't do it. You sort of, you know, laid down markers. There were various, you know, contretemps in the first 5 years of the post-handover period. And by 2003, it looked like the mainland had backed down. But then the combination of the umbrella revolution in 2014 and then what began last year in 2019, I think really, you know, ramped up the pressure on Beijing to say, well, we're going to look, you know, completely gormless if we don't do something to make clear that we're very serious about this need for national security regulation. And they may have overcorrected for what they thought was missing previously in Hong Kong by taking the draconian moves that they did. But it was almost predictable that they would, because especially with the strongman, you know, emperor for life realm that Xi Jinping is trying to create, he can't be seen as weak in the face of this, and he can't be seen as backing down in what looks like an insurrection of the freest group of people in the greater Chinese polity.
Professor Sang, I wonder if you'd like to add anything on that.
As a foreigner in the National Security Council, my suggestion will be to Mr. President, what would you like to achieve, Mr. President? Is it about punishing China and whatever the consequences, or are there specific objectives to achieve? And what is the reality about China's policy towards Hong Kong? Is there any chance that China can be persuaded to change its Hong Kong policy? And my advice would be that in terms of change of policy towards Hong Kong, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I mean, with respect, Paul, I don't think it's so much as a response to the colonial legacy, but to the fact that the Hong Kong situation got into where we are, essentially because Xi Jinping changed his policy towards Hong Kong. About 2012, China took a much harder line over Hong Kong, and that created a response in Hong Kong, and the whole generation of your young protesters, of your Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, Agnes Chow generations was born because of the patriotic education campaign that was being imposed. And the subsequent events from 2012 all the way to 2019 also reflected failures of Chinese government policy, which was not in play before. Hong Kong was fine in that one country, two system model, trucking along, not ideally, but in a way that was acceptable to most people. And with that happening, and with Xi Jinping being the strongman in China, there's no way that Mr. Strongman can acknowledge and admit he made a mistake over Hong Kong, and his mistake is largely responsible for it. So that's not going to happen. So there's no point in trying to seek to reverse China's policy towards Hong Kong, because that's not going to happen. What we can do is to see what we can do to help Hong Kong and make sure that what happens in Hong Kong stays there and doesn't actually become much more of a serious issue. And here we're looking at also, to me, the breaking of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an international agreement registered at the United Nations. if China cannot be trusted to respect this treaty, can it be trusted to respect the other treaties? Now, here I think the United States really should be working with its allies. And the same is also applies of the United States taking a lead in finding a ways to help people in Hong Kong who will, moving forward in the next few years, face the consequences of the new national security law. We cannot protect them, but at least we can give them a way out, we can save them. Again, to do that, it has to be a joint international effort with US working with its allies. And working with allies is not like what the Secretary of State has done to fly to London and make that pronouncement, which actually is very difficult for the British government to respond to, because we don't want to break in relationship with China for all that we have been saying about Hong Kong. And we don't want to be seen as a stooge of the United States. An approach that actually engage with allies and talk with the allies and come up with a common share approach, I think would work much better, much more better in terms of responding to China and also in terms of rebuilding the leadership role that the United States historically had enjoyed. Now, how much of that will go down in a tolerable way in the White House, I have not a focused idea. Over to you, Jacob.
It's clear that Pompeo, in meeting with Nathan Law, is trying to stick a thumb in the eye of the Beijing authorities. We have a question from Richard Bush of the Brookings Institution that asks what the, it did not directly ask, but there are implications for the US. And he asks, what are the consequences of the national security law for foreign NGOs, especially American NGOs that sponsor activities in Hong Kong? And I would add, wouldn't they be a prime target for retaliation by the Chinese authorities? Perhaps, Professor Sang, you can address that first.
I am not sure. I think it's a very important question that needs to be addressed. I think international NGOs will need to bear that in mind. As a university person, I'm already thinking about what may happen to our students. If our students on campus were asking questions or making statements which will be reported back into China, they could be in trouble, and we need to be thinking about their security. So the international NGOs will certainly need to think about that. I would be a little bit surprised if, in spite of what Beijing has said about the extraterritorial provision of the national security law, that their intention is to pick on individuals working in either NGOs or universities and apply that law to them. I think there's much more meant to be a shot across the bows to warn us, to get us to not do that and exercise self-censorship. And I don't like the idea of self-censorship. I think if I have to be censored, let me be censored, but I'm not going to censor myself ahead of the time. But yes, that is something that we need to be working on, but it is something that I think we in the private sector, the non-government sector will have to work with governments to come up with a coordinated and effective response to make sure that that extraterritorial provisions cannot really be applied.
Professor Feinemann or Ambassador Tong, would you like to address this question about the NGOs? Ambassador Tong?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. I just think it depends on what activities NGOs are involved in. I would expect that, you know, an NGO that is an international NGO that, say, is fundraising to help, you know, assist in health issues in third countries, that kind of thing, is going to be just fine. An NGO which is working with opposition political figures to strengthen the democratic movement in Hong Kong is probably not going to be allowed to continue.
Professor Feinerman?
I think there's a big gray area between the two extremes that Ambassador Tong just mentioned. There are a lot of NGOs operating in Hong Kong where people are doing, for example, I went to Hong Kong first right after college in 1971 to teach for an organization that was then known as Yale in China. And I went and taught English as a foreign language to students at the Chinese University of Hong Kong from 1971 to 1973. Yale China is still operating in Hong Kong, but the teachers that they send now will have to think about what kind of things they can say in the classroom, what kind of contacts they can have with other organizations in Hong Kong during the time that they're there. And there's a panoply of other organizations, everything from Christian missionaries to secular organizations that do all kinds of relief and other work in Hong Kong, where people are going to have to figure out where the red lines are and exactly what they can do and say in the work that they do that won't cross a line that is yet to be defined with regard to what's acceptable now under this new national security law.
We have a pointed question from Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post. He asks, there's a sharpening ideological confrontation with China that has a degree of bipartisan support. Some of this seems very justified, namely the outrage over China's overreach in Hong Kong and the dystopian detention regime in Xinjiang. What are the risks, though, that are posed by the current course of confrontation and escalation, including the move today regarding the PRC consulate in Houston? I'd like to start with Paul.
Actually, I think there's a connection between that question and the last one, because the thought occurred to me, since the ostensible or the declared reason for closing the consulate in Houston was its involvement in espionage activities and influence operations, I think that at least raises a question in my mind as to whether the Chinese, as they contemplate how they're going to retaliate for that, might look at what they have long viewed as collusion between NGOs in Hong Kong and the US consulate there in influence operations or whatever. I agree with Kurt's point that there is a wide range of NGOs in Hong Kong, only some of which will fall under that kind of suspicion or review by the Chinese, but I think there's a connection there. In terms of the broader ideological confrontation, I think the risk, to answer the question, is that the United States, I frankly think that for however valid the reason was for closing the consulate, I'm concerned about whether the administration is thinking through all of the implications, potential consequences of some of these actions as we escalate our confrontation with China. I think that's a potentially dangerous course, and I think it also risks overestimating the relative leverage we have over China in pushing the envelope on a lot of these issues. I think the confrontation is less existentially ideological than it's been portrayed to be, and I think that fuels a very kind of knee-jerk response to some of these issues that I think can lead to an escalatory cycle that we could lose control over.
When you say lose control, do you mean like in July 1914? We're in July 2020 now.
I joked about that with a couple of people earlier, but I don't think we're anywhere like that, obviously, because I don't think we're on a path to actual military conflict like we were in July 1914, but I think we are on a potential path to what has been referred to by many commentators as a new Cold War. As a Cold War historian, I have issues with the comparison there. I prefer not to call it that because I just don't think it meets the framework, the definition that everybody seems to borrow from the US-Soviet example. But I think there is the risk of a potential escalation to a much more confrontational strategic competition, a certain extent to which is going to be inevitable because we are strategic competitors, but it need not be militarized and it need not be exaggerated.
Ambassador Tong, how dangerous is the situation right now? Events do seem to be moving quickly.
I think there's an element of danger in decision-making not being grounded, as Professor Tong was saying earlier. It's important for decisions on policy to be made with a specific objective in mind and an evaluation, as Paul just said, of leverage versus realistic outcomes and the like. And there is a certain pattern going on right now of foreign policy by announcement that seems to be intended primarily at domestic politics rather than accomplishment of some specific objectives. The question that came in talked about an ideological confrontation, and I would turn that back on the questioner and say, what is an ideological confrontation? China clearly is an authoritarian state. Americans think that's not a good situation, but that doesn't necessarily have any impact on American ideology. And I don't personally feel threatened that the United States is going to succumb to authoritarianism because China is abusing its own population. So you need to think through what the objectives are and then think about the best tools in order to achieve those objectives in the foreign policy realm.
Professor Feinerman?
Well, just tagging along on what Ambassador Tong was just speaking about, I think that we have something of a problem of our own if we want to go too far down the road of criticizing what's been happening in Hong Kong. We're doing the same thing, at least the Trump administration is doing the same thing in Portland, Oregon, that we're accusing the government of Hong Kong doing now that they're empowered by the new national security law. In fact, going a good deal further. So I think that there's a danger that the PRC will just throw back in our faces. Pot calling the kettle black. We're just doing to pacify people who are our citizens who have caused great disorder in the same exact way that you're doing it in your country, in your territory. So bugger off.
Professor Song?
I am never in favor of closing diplomatic missions. I mean, to me, diplomacy is a matter of convenience. Diplomacy is needed the most when your relationships are not friendly. And therefore, when the going gets tough, we need more diplomats on the ground rather than fewer on the ground. So I have no idea why the Houston consulate is being closed, but I would be inclined to think that that does not seem like a particularly good way of dealing with the situation. But on the point about whether there is kind of, in quotation marks, ideological conflict, I think ideological perhaps is not quite the right word, but there is a bit of a contending of two value systems. And here we do have a bit of a problem there. With all due respect to our American colleagues, I think the United States had, since Woodrow Wilson, has a policy of making the world safe for democracies. And the Chinese foreign policy now under Xi Jinping clearly is to make the world safe for authoritarianism. And the two are not mutually comfortable with each other. A world that is safe for authoritarianism is a world that is uncomfortable for democracies and vice versa. And which is exactly why the Chinese government, which I don't think they are at the moment planning on anything like global domination. They want to be in a world in which China is safe for the Communist Party of China. And that's why they want a world that is safe for authoritarianism, a world that is not a good place for color revolutions. And here I think that contest between the value system is a real one. We need to acknowledge that. But it doesn't mean that the only way to deal with it is a Cold War. I think there are potentially more creative ways to deal with it, even if we acknowledge that there is a conflict in terms of the value systems being put forward.
Well, we have a question from George Beebe, who is Vice President of the Center for the National Interest. And George raises the specter, I think, of a credibility gap. He asks, does China view Hong Kong as a test of American resolve that Beijing will use to decide how far and how fast it can push on Taiwan and other matters? Should the US fashion its policies toward the issue with this in mind? Why don't we start with Ambassador Tong?
That's a great question, and and certainly the United States needs to show determination and strength of will with respect to how it views China's promises on Hong Kong and the implementation of those promises, and attempting to, through various means, hold China to its promise in recognition that it's actually a win-win situation if China does so. The problem, though, with the supposition is that there's a direct parallel between the Hong Kong situation and the Taiwan situation, and they're quite different. Taiwan is an island with a military. Hong Kong is a population already under Chinese administration. And so I believe that both the situation is different and US policy should be framed differently and executed differently. I do think that there's a need for the United States to be clear about its support for maintenance of the status quo across the Taiwan Straits in all the aspects of that, including our pledge to supply the Taiwan military with necessary material to defend itself. And so maintaining our both explicit and implicit promises vis-a-vis Taiwan is the way to address this, rather than trying to score points through on Hong Kong. I think that the two are related, but they're also not. It's not a direct kind of domino effect sort of situation. I've been an advocate of, for example, the United States doing a free trade agreement or a trade agreement with Taiwan in order to reinforce that relationship on the economic and interpersonal basis in order to strengthen our interactions with Taiwan. And I think that's something that that should be seriously considered. And there's other things that the U.S. can do to support Taiwan.
Professor Feinerman, what are your thoughts?
Yes, well, I agree with most of what Ambassador Tong said. I think in particular, one of the things we might also consider is strengthening our alliances with other democratic countries in the region, which seems to be something that's fallen by the wayside in the Trump administration. You know, the outreach to North Korea has, I think, damaged the firmness with which we have allied with South Korea and agreed for its mutual defense, and also Japan, because those are going to be much more convincing to China in terms of our resolve with regard to Taiwan than I think, saber rattling about Hong Kong, which we have, as Ambassador Tong mentioned, very little we can do about. It's part of the mainland and governed by it. But Taiwan is still free and independent, and we're going to need some help. The recent feints that the U.S. 7th Fleet has made with regard to freedom of navigation and exercises like that, I think are quite important in expressing, in various ways our resolve to maintain those alliances and make sure that the other nations in the region that are allied with us are going to be fully under the protective wing of the United States military and especially its Navy, which I think has been somewhat under question in the last couple of years. And we need to make sure that that's the message that we're sending with regard to whatever China might do vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Professor Song, what's your perspective from London?
I don't think the Chinese see how US responds to Hong Kong as a test case. I wouldn't go that far, but I think they will watch it very, very carefully. I think we have to start with the reality, which is that whatever the Americans do about Hong Kong, if and when China has the capacities to take Taiwan, they will. I don't think a very strong, robust American response on Hong Kong will deter the Chinese from doing that. So we have to start with that reality. The second thing is that even though it's not a test case, but how the Americans' response to Hong Kong will be watched very carefully in Beijing. If the Americans fumble and basically get uncoordinated and ineffective responses over Hong Kong, that's a good indication that the Americans may well be doing something similar when the Taiwan case comes up. And that might well therefore be encouraging the Chinese to think that they can advance the timetable over Taiwan a bit earlier. And I don't think it's going to be dramatically earlier, because ultimately it depends on the availability of capabilities that can deter the Americans from interfering over Taiwan and be overwhelming enough to force Taiwan's government to negotiate for a solution. So the important thing is, over Hong Kong, is for the United States to respond in a smart and effective and well thought out way, even though the United States cannot reverse what China is doing in Hong Kong. And if the US respond in that way, I think it will be much more useful in terms of how it will get the Chinese to think harder over Taiwan. But again, I would be very surprised if anything that can be done to stop the Xi Jinping administration from its commitment and determination to take Taiwan before Xi Jinping finally, eventually relinquished power.
Paul Hare of the Center for the National Interest, what do you think of your colleague George Beebe's question about this issue, whether there could be a question of credibility over Hong Kong that would influence China's or Beijing's approach to a host of other issues that bedevil the US-China relationship?
Well, specifically with regard to Hong Kong, I mean, I think I agree with what's been said. I think the differences between Hong Kong and Taiwan are greater than the similarities in terms of whether it's leading Beijing to, I mean, so Beijing certainly isn't doing what it's doing in Hong Kong for the purpose of testing the Americans. But I think that, you know, they'll certainly draw some lessons from this. But I think the Chinese recognize the differences that Kurt and others have laid out between the two situations. I mean, the Chinese, they have effective control and sovereignty over Hong Kong. They do not have effective control and sovereignty over Taiwan. And in fact, I don't think they ever intended one country, two systems to be applied the same way in both. Having said that, they're not looking for an excuse to use force against Taiwan because they know it would be counterproductive, at least in the time being. And I think that the US-China tensions over Taiwan are developing for reasons independent of what's happening in Hong Kong. They have a lot to do with, you know, some of the politics on the island and the perception in Beijing that Washington is aiding and abetting what they always see as this drift toward separatism. So I think the differences are there. But I think, I guess, you know, you asked the broader, I mean, there's a lot of other manifestations in the US-China relationship that for which Hong Kong, Beijing's actions in Hong Kong have implications. I think those can be overstated, but they clearly are highlighting, you know, the differences over governing styles and the perception of national security. And maybe we can get into those in terms of what the broader implications are for China's behavior elsewhere in the region.
Well, I'm pleased to announce that we have a final question from Michael Martin, who asks, what about US relations with the Hong Kong government? In some ways, the Hong Kong government has been rather aggressive in its implementation of the national security law, threatening to disqualify candidates who participated in the informal primaries, stating that slogans and banners are potentially acts of subversion. The Hong Kong police force arresting peaceful protesters holding up white blank pieces of paper. He asks, in conclusion, is there or are there any options available for getting the Hong Kong government to be less aggressive in its compliance with the PRC's policy on Hong Kong? Paul, why don't you tackle that first?
Oh gosh, actually I think Kurt or James or even Steve might be more qualified to address that one.
Okay, let's go to Ambassador Tong then.
You know, I would have low expectations for the ability for the US to change how the Hong Kong government implements the national security law, because the Hong Kong government is doing that at the instruction and with the tutelage of Beijing. And so the differential in, that's not a fruitful area for trying to influence the Hong Kong government. So I would think that there is an element of maintaining a relationship with the Hong Kong government, which I think is useful to the United States over the long run. And that would be to work with the Hong Kong government where possible in areas where the government continues to operate with relative autonomy and discretion. In the economic realm, in some of the legal issues, I think it would be useful to have some judicial cooperation or conferences between the United States and the Hong Kong judiciary. Continue to have contacts between the US Congress and the Hong Kong legislature, and then have contacts between the executives on specific issues where they can work together in order to maintain those ties and kind of help Hong Kong continue to exercise its autonomy muscles in the area where it can do that. Specifically deterring how the national security law is implemented, I think would be a little more difficult.
Professor Song, what's your take?
I think I'm with Ambassador Tong here. I think it's easy for the United States to overreact, which may not necessarily be a very good thing. I think engaging with the Hong Kong government is probably in some ways more effective in trying to encourage the government to exercise more of its autonomous power than simply do second guess what Beijing wants and go beyond what Beijing perhaps might even be expecting them to do. But potentially, if it's necessary, potentially, I think the very specific and limited application of the Global Magnitsky Act to a few named individuals in the Hong Kong government could potentially send a signal. But it has to be very, very limited use of it. Otherwise, you cut off too much of your people to engage with, and you really don't want to do that. But picking a very small number of them to send the signal that yes, if you go very hard on this, you will have a personal price to pay. But we still will continue to engage. It's not with the office. The application of the Magnitsky Act would be against an individual, but not against the office. So it could apply, for example, to the police commissioner and say the chief executive, to the holder of that office at the moment, but not to the holder of the office in general terms.
I'd like to pose. One
thought,
go ahead, Paul.
If I could. And it gets back to the point that Kurt made earlier about, and I agreed with him on this, the need for a diplomatic initiative that tells the Chinese they made a mistake and they broke their promise. I think one of the things we should include in that dialogue is the notion that if Beijing wants to refute the notion that it's broke its promise, the distinction I made earlier between national security and electoral reform. We should tell them, if you want to convince people you aren't breaking your promises under the basic law, you need to get back on track with electoral reform in terms of how to implement universal suffrage in the selection of the chief executive and the rest of the process in Hong Kong. And that's a lever to apply to the Hong Kong government.
I'd like to finish with a final question to all four of our distinguished panelists that draws again on Ishan Tarur's earlier question about the degree of risks that we are running. So I would like to ask each panelist to take up to a minute and explain not necessarily so much where we would like to see things headed, but where do you think they actually are headed in the next 5 months? We're in an election season. The Trump administration, particularly the President and Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, have been sounding warnings about Chinese perfidy, and you try and use it as an election issue. So I'd like to start with Ambassador Tong and say, how optimistic are you? Where do you think we're headed? Because even Joe Biden is warning about China as well. There is a bipartisan consensus, rightly or wrongly, that China poses a dire and immediate threat to American interests. So Ambassador Tong, what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, there should be a bipartisan consensus that China is a big problem for the United States as a foreign policy problem, and that the fundamental nature of our relationship is competitive rather than cooperative. That's a perfectly good consensus point and basis for policy making. What needs to happen, and I think it's much more likely if Vice President Biden is elected, is some systematic thought and clear policy making aimed at specific objectives and reviewing each of those actions based upon US national interests, rather than framing things in a cartoonish fashion where we're just, as someone used the metaphor previously, poking a thumb in the eye whenever possible in order to score publicity points rather than actual accomplishments on behalf of the American taxpayer and citizenry. And so I'm hopeful, actually, that will take place once we get past this election. And I think it's much more likely to take place under Biden administration.
Professor Feinerman?
I definitely agree with that. And I would just say that as well, there's a real danger that the policies we've been pursuing most recently under the Trump administration have this great danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of all the things that we like to do and the people and groups we like to engage with in Hong Kong. And just to go back to some things that were said previously, I think there are organizations, including in the legal realm, the two past chief justices of the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong have been model jurists and committed to the rule of law. And I think that there's every reason to believe that that will go on in the courts. I think in the business community, especially the international business community in Hong Kong, there's a great desire to remain fully engaged with the rest of the world. And we have to make sure that, the things that we do that are legitimate sanctions, Stephen mentioned the idea of, for example, taking the chief executive under the Global Magnitsky Act. I'm not sure that we want to do that, or at least want to hold our fire to see what develops down the road in Hong Kong, because those are going to be things that can't be taken back. They're going to make it very difficult to try and have a balanced relationship with Hong Kong going into the future.
Professor Song.
Looking ahead for the next 5 months, I'm afraid that I'm a bit of a pessimist there. I think the relationship between US and China is going to get much more difficult and not necessarily being very strategic from the perspective of the United States. I think I see it as something that is going to be caught up in the electoral cycle. And I also see Hong Kong being caught up in that. And therefore, we are unlikely to see a very strategic response from Washington, which will put the interests of Hong Kong, by which I mean people of Hong Kong, ahead of electoral considerations. I'm afraid that also probably is going to be the case in terms of the wider US-China relationship, that the electoral interests will be being put ahead of what, as an academic, I will see as US national interests.
Paul.
Well, in terms of where I think the relationship is headed, I would agree with what's been said. I think we're on a downward trajectory toward a very confrontational relationship. And I think there's two things wrong with that. It's being driven on the one hand by, frankly, the Trump administration's electoral calculations. They think this is going to be a positive boon for them by parlaying the China threat. But secondly, because I think, frankly, I think analytically, it's based on some flawed assumptions and characterizations of the nature and the scope of the threat that China poses. I think China does pose a profound and unprecedented strategic challenge to us, unlike and even more profound than the Soviet Union did, because they bring a lot more to the table than the Soviet Union was able to do, to that competition than the Soviet Union was ever able to do. But it's not dire, and it's not immediate, and it's not existential. And I think we just need to have a more balanced assessment and a more valid set of premises about what we're dealing with. And we need to be, frankly, I mean, this has been said by a lot of people, our response needs to be to up our own competitive game rather than to complain and exaggerate about the nature of what we're dealing with.
Well said. I'd like to express my gratitude to all four of our participants for joining us in this informative webinar on the implications of the national security law for Hong Kong. I admired the lucidity and clarity of their expositions, and I hope you did too. And with that, I would say that this session is now closed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.